Morning, people. Here's a debate that I did on BBC Radio 4 about whether it's okay to share your political views at work, especially given everything that's going on in the Middle East. Now, it mostly speaks for itself, but we're going to need to talk about some of it.
Now, with me throughout this episode are two people who come at this discussion from different perspectives. Femi Olawola is an opinion writer at The Independent. Also in the studio with me is James Esses, who's written opinion columns for the Daily Mail, The Telegraph and Spiked. Femi, I mentioned in the introduction there that post on X, still call it a tweet, I want to call it a tweet, about the medic, an anonymous medic, we don't know where they were, but wearing a pin badge that was half a stethoscope, half a Palestinian flag. What's your take on whether that medic should or should not have been allowed to wear that at work?
I think in your intro, there was one person that made the point that this is really, it's not supposed necessarily about whether or not that individual should wear that specific symbol. It's about the double standard that if there was a medic wearing a poppy during this period of time, would that be considered inappropriate for the workplace? I think a lot of people would say no. And yet supposedly wearing a Palestinian flag, which right now, given that the people of Gaza are experiencing what the UN has referred to as ethnic cleansing, that shouldn't be that controversial. Being against some major atrocities in the world shouldn't be controversial. Similarly, if you're going to say that a poppy, which also refers to war, isn't controversial, I don't see why there should be attacks on the medic.
And obviously the Israeli government and the UK government would say it's not ethnic cleansing that's happening at the moment, but we can leave that issue to one side because we're talking about the symbols. So you're completely supportive of a nurse or a doctor or a healthcare assistant wearing a badge with a Palestinian flag on it, on the uniform?
I'd say yes, it can strike conversations, but we do also need to remember that these are people. I think too often we look at nurses, medics, doctors as these instruments of the NHS that we pay for, but they are people. We saw what they went through to look after us during COVID. They put their lives on the line. Many of them died, and we clapped for them because we supposedly remember that they were people. We seem to have forgotten that they should have the right to express themselves.
James, pro-badge or anti-badge in this case?
Very much anti-badge. I mean, Femi mentioned about double standards. We can get into that. But, my position generally is that, particularly in the context of public sector organisations and workers, they should be free from any form of ideological symbolism whatsoever. I would say, at best, it's utterly irrelevant, and at worst, it's utterly unprofessional to do so.
What if it had been, a badge with the Scotland flag on it?
Well, I think that, if you're wearing something that represents the nation that you are living in, for example, part of the United Kingdom, a Union Jack or whatever, I don't believe that's an ideologically based symbol, because that's a universal symbol that applies to all individuals living in this country. It's very different to wading into external conflicts such as what's going on in Israel and Gaza at the moment.
Femi?
Wearing a Scottish flag or a Union Jack flag can mean 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. If you wear a Scottish flag, you might be arguing in favour of independence for Scotland and saying that you detest the Westminster government imposing its laws on a Scottish government that constantly never votes for the same government as Westminster. If you were a Union Jack, there are many people that might say, well, you're already here. Why do you have to go over and above to show that you're here? Or are you suggesting some sort of excessive sense of national pride? And what does that mean? This is the double standards that I'm talking about. That you would be okay with those sorts of symbols. You'd probably be okay with the poppy, but being okay with the expression of support for the people of Palestine, especially given what they're going through, somehow that's controversial.
Our public sector is built on the foundations of neutrality and impartiality, and those at the receiving end of those supplies or services want to know that they're going to be treated in that respect. And I would imagine that it would be highly uncomfortable, offensive and concerning for many people if they see their healthcare professional wearing a Palestinian flag. It says something about how they're viewing the world. It also says something about how they might be judged. And I can imagine people would be fearful of that healthcare professional finding out, for example, that maybe they supported Israel in this conflict.
Yeah, let's drill into this idea of neutrality. Neutrality is very much a lie, because there's that phrase about what is equality. Is equality treating everybody the same, or is equality recognizing that there are already pre-existing injustices? So if Jack has 5 sweets and Jill has 3 sweets, if you give both of them 2 sweets, Jack will still have more. That's not equality. Similarly, if we are in a status quo where the status quo is a problem, if we are in a situation where, for example, if we're dealing with the police was recently found to be the Metropolitan Police was recently found to be institutionally racist, sexist, and homophobic. So that is the status quo.
So one person's neutrality is another person's inequality.
Exactly. So to suggest that it's be wrong to stick out against that by wearing a badge, by expressing your view, you're just in sort of concretizing, cementing the status quo, which is a problem. And you might feel especially unsafe with a police officer that wasn't in some way saying, I'm not like the rest.
The problem is, if we're allowing in these kind of ideological symbols, who gets to decide what is right or what is wrong, in any given moment? This is the problem. That level of subjectivity creeps in, and it can become very oppressive in its own right.
James, you talk about who gets to decide. Well, some of the people who decide are members of parliament when they pass legislation. Some of the people who decide are judges at various levels of court. And so it's a combination of legislation and legal decisions.
I would go back to what we said before about the idea that who makes these decisions? Well, it's Parliament, the elected Parliament. That relies on us actually having a functioning democracy, which the UK doesn't, because in pretty much every election, a party with a minority of the vote gets a majority of the seats.
Let's not get into the electoral system. We'll do another episode on that. But,
Now, you see how the BBC host shut me down there, implying that our voting system isn't relevant to our ability to express ourselves politically. Now, I may have laughed it off, but don't worry, we'll get back to that.
James, a bit of a case study that's happened in the last few weeks. The tube driver who got suspended after the footage circulated on social media, apparently showing them leading Free Palestine chants on the tube after one of the marches. What's your take on that situation? Bear in mind we don't know all the details and it's still being investigated.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the clip, and if it is how it's portrayed, I think that was an abhorrent abuse of position and power. I think it's utterly unprofessional, and certainly this individual should be given the sack if it's as it was portrayed.
Femi?
I think we have to look at the context we're dealing with here. I know you said the government has the right to reply, etc., but we are talking about the United Nations saying that we're close to a genocide, that ethnic cleansing is going on, that 10,000 civilians are dying in Gaza.
But does that justify the tube driver using the TfL tannoy on the tube to make a statement about it?
But listen to the words you're saying. Using a tan is 10,000 dead people commensurate with using a tannoy to lead a chant saying this shouldn't happen.
But the tannoy is to say, please mind the gap, and the next station is Piccadilly Circus.
And if the government is going directly against the wishes of the people, which are the polls showed that roughly 60% support a ceasefire, and we're being silenced again because we don't have a functioning democracy, I think we do end up with a situation where people end up having to use whatever
it's
power
the guy
they
who
have.
says please mind. In fact, the please mind the gap is pre-recorded. It's the guy or woman saying what the next stop is, or please get your rucksack out of the doors.
You're going to end up with a certain degree of disobedience if you have the government go against the wishes of the people.
But Femi, again, I come back to this point of who is to decide what is acceptable to say and what isn't. I mean, people can make a case for some of the worst atrocities that have taken place over the course of history. The Nazis themselves were able to put out plenty of propaganda justifying what they were doing and saying, well, it's in the public interest to spread our message.
Just so we're clear, this guy just likened a train driver using his speaker system to say that we should not be supporting genocide to Nazi genocide.
Who decides what these individuals can and cannot say?
Yeah, so on that who decides, again, that gets split in two ways. Are we talking about the public, as in who gets to judge them, or who actually will enforce whether or not they can and cannot do those things? If we're talking about the public, well, the public decides whether or not they think that tube driver did the right thing. If we're talking about who legally makes the decision, we're talking about a government that was elected by 44% of the people. You have a majority control.
What about the people? So on the train, there was a big group of people who joined in the chant, but what about the people that you can't see, you can't hear, who, I don't know, maybe were Jewish and felt really threatened by it?
Well, I think this separation of Jewish versus pro-Palestinians, I think is a false dichotomy, because I've been on those marches and I've marched alongside Jewish and Israeli people who oppose this.
Put that to one. I'm just saying, actually, on that train, forget the identity or ethnicity or beliefs of the people.
Do you see how quickly that narrative fell apart?
But some people might have felt threatened for whatever reason.
Well, if you're calling for peace, if you're saying that we should stop bombing innocent civilians, I don't think anyone reasonable would feel threatened by that.
Well, the chant wasn't peace, peace, peace everywhere. Love, love, love.
Free Palestine. If it was pre-Palestine, then that's literally saying stop bombing Palestine. End the illegal occupation, which has been deemed illegal by the United Nations, by Human Rights Watch.
James, we shouldn't be judge and jury on this tube driver who none of us know and is the subject of an investigation. But you did say they should be fired for doing that. Yes. Why the ultimate sanction? Why not as slap on the wrist? Why fired?
Because as far as I'm concerned, this is in the realms of gross misconduct. These employees...
Why is it gross misconduct rather than just a mistake or a misjudgment?
Well, I certainly wouldn't call it a mistake. There was a certain level of intentionality behind what was done there. He very clearly knew what he was doing. He had plenty of time to think about it as well. Nobody had a gun to his head.
Don't people make mistakes in the heat of the moment, though, when it's passionate?
I guess if you're, let's say, walking down the street and somebody approaches you and they say something and you might respond, with your immediate reaction. But for this individual whose job is to drive the train and announce to mind the gap, for him to press the tannoy on and proactively decide to make that type of comment, I think it's completely different.
Femi, if the tube driver ends up getting fired for this, what would that make you think about Transport for London for employers?
Exactly. I was going to come into James's defense and say that, yes, the notion of being disobedient does mean that you're probably going to end up with some consequences. So if he is reprimanded, if he is suspended, I wouldn't have a great deal of complaint against that. But losing his job, especially under these circumstances, to permanently change his life for simply speaking out against ethnic cleansing, I don't think that's a reasonable response, and I would judge TfL for that.
So my issue, Femi, is that, I fundamentally believe people should be entitled to whatever beliefs they want, but there is a difference when someone puts on the uniform and they are acting under the framework, even representing their place of work or their employer. It's different duties and different standards there. So if this individual wanted to kind of speak about this in his own free time, even attend these marches, write on Twitter, I've got no issue with that. But as I say, I believe it's an abuse of power and position to do it when he's on the job.
So we don't disagree. Does the employer have the right to fire him for that because it breaches whatever codes they have? I understand they have that right, but I will still judge TfL for choosing to significantly damage the life of somebody who simply chose that under the circumstances where this person's government is supporting the ethnic cleansing of 2 million people, he was going to speak out and use whatever platform he could to do so. He had a microphone. He took that opportunity because his morality, his conscience drove him to do that. I don't think his life should be ruined for that.
Right. Femi, where do you stand on the poppy?
I got into trouble for this a few years ago when I criticized a certain organization's rules against virtue signaling.
Let me guess, was it this organization?
It may have been.
Okay, right.
And I said that if you're going to allow the poppy and say that that's not virtue signaling, but a Black Lives Matter flag or a pride flag is virtue signaling, it shows where your values lie. Because the notion of a poppy, my understanding is it's to show respect for the war dead because those lives matter. Yet saying that Black Lives Matter is somehow controversial. What we deem to be controversial, what we deem to be political, says a lot about what we think is up for debate. Apparently, the lives of black people and the basic notion of equality for black people is up for debate for some people. So the right to wear a poppy, absolutely, but don't allow the right to wear a poppy in circumstances where you wouldn't allow the right to wear other virtue signaling things.
But wasn't one of the issues around the Black Lives Matter movement was that it wasn't just the idea that Black Lives mattered, it's that there was there was political content there, and like some of the organizers of Black Lives Matter had actual very distinctive political aims. So rather than it just being a general call for Black Lives to matter, it was a campaign with some political aims.
The Black Lives Matter movement spans the entire globe. It started in 2012. It's been there are various offshoots around the world. It is a movement. It's not an organization. We can very easily understand the difference between the small c conservative and large C conservative party. Yet with this, somehow it's hard for people to get their heads around the basic principle that Black Lives Matter, that we should support equality, shouldn't be a questionable, controversial issue. Yet some people chose to act as if it was. I'm sure people people who sell poppies, wear poppies, have various different views. And so do the people who wear Black Lives Matter and supports Black Lives Matter movement have different views. But the core principle of we should be in a racially equal society, that's all it's about.
Okay, James, the poppy.
Well, I mean, just to say I fundamentally disagree with Flemming on the Black Lives Matter point, and it would seem that he supports symbolism when it backs up something that he is personally in support of.
Sorry, what? I think he forgot which side of the argument he's on. I'm not the one saying we shouldn't be allowed to express our political views at work. I'm just saying we shouldn't have a double standard about it. He's the one who, right at the start of this debate, said we shouldn't be allowed to wear Palestine flags, but should be allowed to wear Union Jack flags. And he's accusing me of only supporting the symbols that I like? Okay.
In terms of the poppy, I'm going to distinguish it from some of the examples we spoke about earlier because it is directly linked to a national day of remembrance in our calendar. There was a kind of principle of universality there. It's commemorating people who have died. So I'm going to put that in a different bucket to some of the examples we spoke about earlier as well.
Just come back to a point you made earlier, James, about Remembrance Day. And so poppy is a much more sort of, in your mind, universal symbol because we've got a national day of remembrance. In 10 years' time, say there was a new bank holiday celebrating, I don't know what you want to call it, but diversity, and there was a symbol that you could equate with Black Lives Matter or supporting minorities and underprivileged groups, and there was would you be okay with everyone sort of collectively wearing that symbol if in 10 years' time we decided that was a bank holiday or a ceremony we wanted to have?
If there's been a national holiday created off the back of a democratically elected government, then again, as I say, I would view that in a slightly different context to some of the other forms of symbolism we've discussed. But generally, I come back to the point that I believe that we are better off, particularly in a public sector context, of being ideologically neutral.
And so, Femi, just to put, Femi, I was going to say to you, I mean, the thing is, as we just heard from Charlotte, the poppy's been around for 100 years. It's like, doesn't that mean it's kind of just settled? It's just a symbol that as a country we've signed up to.
Yeah, but
whereas there were other things that are still fresher and haven't been settled yet.
Not everything from 100 years ago is exactly what we want. I mean, the idea that you would be able to wear a Black Lives Matter symbol at all 100 years ago in the UK, highly questionable. And this is why I did mention the thing about the electoral system, because as James just mentioned, he'd be okay with it if it was passed by a democratically elected government. Because in every election in the UK, a party of the minority of the vote always gets the majority of the seats in Parliament. That means the majority of votes, which went to the other parties, never matter. So we don't get the opportunity to express our view in Parliament. We don't get that ability. So sometimes all we can do is protest, is wear badges. And yet even those things are being pushed back against. We've seen the laws that have been clamping down on protests in recent years. We've now got people that are angry, even expressing pronouns or how you choose to identify, as if we haven't always said, oh, this is what I'd like to be called in the workplace or something like that. This is the suppression of basic free speech that people in James' position often say they're against.
I told you I'd bring it back, because before that BBC host tried to pretend that our voting system wasn't relevant to a discussion about political expression, but then he allowed the Conservative guy to base his entire argument on the principle that we already have a functioning and democratic voting system. Because the people who want to protect the status quo, to keep things as they are, really don't want us talking about this. And you can see why, because this country would ditch our first past the post voting system for a more proportional voting system in a heartbeat. Anyway, I'm Femi, this has been F Politics, so politics doesn't F you. Have a great week.